As was Jesus' custom when he'd been late in Jerusalem, he was spending the night out on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. Other times he went back out to Bethany if he had more time. But this was Passover night, and they'd had the Passover meal in an upper room. Judas had gone out to tell the chief priests where Jesus could be found, and Jesus had come to the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing that Judas was coming. But he didn't run away, he didn't go and hide, he just prayed. So he didn't respond in fear of the things that he knew were going to happen. He faced them with God's support. The disciples could have stood with him, but they went to sleep while Jesus prayed. And now Jesus wakes them up, and immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely." As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and kissed him. And they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus answered and said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then they all forsook him and fled. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share from Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 52. The arrest of Jesus. As we've noted, it's the eve of Passover, which means there is a full moon. Light under the olive trees would be dappled, but it's not too difficult to make your way around, up the path and into the garden. The chief priests had sent quite a group with Judas to arrest Jesus. They came with swords and clubs ready for a fight, but Jesus is not one who is going to fight. So that he could be sure that it was Jesus who was arrested and not somebody else, Judas had given them a sign, saying, "I'll go up to Jesus and I'll give him a greeting, I'll give him a kiss." This is a normal sign of love and friendship and respect. When I've done that, then you will know who is the person you need to arrest. That's the one that you take. So Judas wasn't concerned to take the others. The chief priests were not concerned about the others, although the disciples didn't know that. And when they saw Jesus arrested, all they could think of was that they needed to flee, and they disappeared in all directions among the trees. But generally nobody was chasing them. Those who betray God's people will often feign love and friendship. They come bearing gifts, but their purpose is against God, not for God. Well, Jesus is arrested. One of them, it turns out it's Peter, but Peter is not identified in the synoptic gospel accounts, only in John's account. Often when somebody does something in the synoptic gospels that could reflect badly on them, they are not particularly identified, because they were still alive when the account was prepared. And so Peter is not identified in this account. John wrote after Peter was dead, and after he was dead there was no problem mentioning that it was Peter who'd done this. He drew his sword. There were 2 swords among the disciples. Peter had one of them. He had told Jesus he would defend him, and he was going to do it, even though he was seriously outnumbered. He's been asleep, he's not really thinking very well, and he didn't ask Jesus what to do, but he lashes out and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. John tells us the right ear, which suggests to me that he came from behind assuming Peter was right-handed. But Jesus tells him to put his sword away. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And Jesus heals the high priest's servant's ear. John tells us the name of the servant of the high priest, in fact, who was healed as well. So there was a testimony that Jesus did not resist arrest, even though one of his misguided disciples did so. Sometimes we will do things in a misguided way outside of the will of God, and we need to be ready to accept the Lord's reprimand. For Jesus' approach, the approach of Christ, is to overcome evil with good, not to retaliate evil for evil. But Jesus speaks to those who've come to arrest him and challenges them. Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? But every day I've been in the temple teaching. Why did you have to come out in the middle of the night? The reason is that they were doing the wrong thing. They didn't want the crowds to come to Jesus' defence, and so they act in a sneaky way. They need a betrayer. But this was all happening according to the Scriptures. It's not that God made a mistake in writing the Scriptures. It's the fact that God knows the end from the beginning. He knows the choices that we will make before we make them, but he doesn't force us to make those choices. He was therefore able to write down in the Scriptures the things that would happen. And when these things are done by people who had no knowledge of the Scriptures or no understanding of the Scriptures, then it shows that God really does know what's going on, and he does have a plan and purpose and a way for it all. So the apostles were able to teach strongly concerning Jesus from the Scriptures, because they could say, well, this is what the Scripture says, and this is what happened to Jesus. You know what happened to Jesus. It just happened last week, last year, whatever. You can go and talk to this person and that person and that person, and they were there, and they'll tell you what happened. But that's what the Scriptures said would happen. Therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. And this was the reason why so many people at the beginning among the Jews turned to Jesus. Mark records, "Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked." It seems that young man was probably Mark himself. As we suggested, the upper room was most likely Mark's family home, and we can imagine a young 10-year-old or so hanging around with the big boys and watching what was going on, not participating in the Last Supper, but watching everything that was going on. And when Jesus went out, he would be keen to go out and sleep out under the stars with Jesus and the disciples that night. He had seen Jesus praying. He had seen the disciples sleeping. Maybe he himself had dropped off to sleep. But when Jesus was arrested, some of the young lads who were in that team spotted him and sought to grab him. But he slithered out from the linen cloth and fled into the darkness also. The point was that no one else was arrested. Jesus, in fact, urged the authorities to let all the disciples go free, for they could not contribute to the redemption of mankind. This was a price that Jesus alone had to pay. Peter, with his sword, was thinking as those sent by the chief priest were thinking. They came with swords and clubs, ready for a fight, to force their way. Paul explained all this by saying, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and wickedness in high places." So the person in front of us carrying the sword is not really the enemy. The enemy is Satan and the spirits that have deceived this man to thinking he is doing the right thing or have commanded him to act in this way. Therefore Jesus says, "Put up the sword. I came into the world to save sinners, not to destroy them."